The clock had turned 9 and I was beginning to get worried. I had not heard from my wife for a while now. I tried calling her a half-dozen times since the afternoon, and the number remained unreachable. This was very unlike her. She has always been accessible by phone, even if she was facing delays due to work. I called her friends and parents, inquiring if she had stopped by. They answered in the negative. My wife Martha works as a real estate agent. She is an enterprising woman and really dedicated towards her job. So I am not usually surprised when she sometimes loses track of time. She got excited when she spoke about a new house listing in the market today. And she left quickly to check out the place. And I haven't heard from her since. Maybe her phone was low on battery and it switched off on its own, I thought. I opened her laptop to check her appointments. She is usually a stickler for details. Always jots down the client's name, time of appointment, and the address of the house they were supposed to visit. I found no new entry on her ledger. This is weird, I thought to myself. For some reason, I just thought I should click on her Facebook profile. I then clicked on Facebook Marketplace, and I could see she had initiated a chat conversation for a house listing in a place that was at least 30 miles away from ours. The building of the house listed looked like one of those old traditional bungalows that still managed to withstand the test of time. Looking at the overgrowth of plants and shrubs on the property, it was clear the place was not very well maintained. It even kind of gave me a spooky vibe. But the property was massive, and that alone must have been worth its weight in gold. No wonder Martha was so excited all day. The person on the other end of the chat had provided his phone number and contact address. I tried calling him on it. It was not reachable. I tried reaching out through the chat option, but there was no response. So I noted now the address of the listing on a piece of paper. I waited for another couple of hours. The clock had turned 11 now. I decided to file a complaint at the police station. I was beginning to fear the worst. The cops were sympathetic to my situation. I had brought Martha's laptop with me to the station. I opened it in front of the police superintendent to show the details of the listing. And it had vanished. I couldn't find the listing anywhere. This is bizarre, I thought. I just saw it an hour ago. The officer was beginning to look at me a little suspiciously. I then remembered the piece of paper on which I had written the address. I removed it from my pocket and showed it to him. He decided to go take a look at the property, and I requested if I could tag along. He nodded. I got into the back of the police van while the officer sat in the front. There were 2 other PCs accompanying us. All kinds of thoughts were going through my mind as I sat there in the Jeep. Will I be able to find Martha? Is she safe? Has she been kidnapped? At one point, I began to wonder if she was having an affair behind my back. I immediately felt a little ashamed of myself. We finally reached the address listed on the paper, and I could not spot any bungalow in the vicinity. All I could see was a row of houses, which is very common in suburban areas. You know, the house with a small garden and a white picket fence? That's all I could see. Just rows and rows of these houses, signifying the average suburban American family. We contacted a few people in the neighborhood to inquire about the bungalow I had seen on the listing, and they were all surprised. They denied its existence. The officer even contacted the local cops in the area, and they all said the address was a mistake. We finally decided to go back to the station. A couple of PCs were giving me strange looks during the drive back. They were probably seeing me as a suspect now. I couldn't even blame them if they did. The officer decided to drop me in front of my home. He probably wanted to check where I lived. He got out of his car and told me, "I will come back and check up on you tomorrow. I will get a constable to drive your car back to your place. Don't worry, we will find your wife," he added. I nodded my head in gratitude. I opened the door to my apartment and got inside and looked at the clock. It was 4 in the morning. I felt truly exhausted with all the worrying. I lied down on the bed and immediately fell asleep. From the bed and got the shock of my life. My wife Martha was sitting on an armchair right next to the bed, looking at me. I immediately got to my feet and rushed towards her. "Martha, where on earth were you all this time? I was really worried about you," I said. She hugged me tightly and replied back,
"I've had quite the day, Jimmy."
"Why didn't you wake me up when you got home?" I asked. "And what happened to your phone? I tried to call you all day," I said in an angry tone.
"I'm sorry, dear. You looked fast asleep, and I didn't want to wake you. I think I lost my phone. I've been looking for it everywhere,"
she replied back. I was still mad at her, but was relieved to see that she was safe. Everything else could wait, I thought. "Did you eat anything? Come, let's go have breakfast," I said. She nodded her head, and we got into the living room to get to the kitchen. Just then, the doorbell started ringing. I opened the door and saw the police officer standing outside. "Good morning, officer. Thank you for coming," I said. "My wife is back home," I added with a warm smile. She was standing right behind me. I just moved a little bit away from the door so that he could see her properly. He looked inside and then looked back at me. "I don't see anybody there other than you," he replied back. Martha then walked towards the entrance and introduced herself.
"Hello, sir. I am Martha."
But the man kept staring at me. "Sir, Martha would like to shake your hand," I said to him. I could see his face swelling with anger. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" he asked me. "You know, I gave you the benefit of the doubt yesterday when you came to the station, but now I think you've been taking me for a ride," he said. "I am wondering if you are even married now, or if you're doing all this because you're starved for attention with nothing better to do," he added. Both Martha and I looked at each other bewildered to see the officer speak this way. He then took out his sidearm and pointed it at me. "Step back," he said. I moved back into the living room with my hands raised. He then started searching one room at a time. He looked at various photos, which included those of our wedding. I even showed him our marriage certificate. Finally, he asked me, "Okay, Jimmy, I believe you." I felt a little relieved. "So what did you do to your wife? Were you bored of your marriage?" he asked. Both Martha and I began to protest. He said, "Shut up. You are coming with me to the station." I got into the back of his police jeep. Martha got in as well and sat next to me. She was looking hopelessly upset. She took my hand and held on to it tightly. For the first time, I began to question my own sanity. Is the person sitting next to me really Martha? I asked myself. Is she even real? Am I looking at some kind of a ghost? I was feeling really low and delusional all at once. As the police officer took control of the wheel, I began to wonder if he had any hidden agenda. Is he jerking me around? What on earth is going on? I thought to myself. When we reached the station, the same pattern repeated. None of the other cops could spot my wife, and it didn't take long for it to turn into an interrogation. They asked all kinds of details about me and my wife, my professional life, if I was under any sort of medication. The stress was really beginning to build up on me. Just then, the officer received a call, and he answered it. He spoke on the phone for a few minutes. He kept glancing at me every now and then like he was judging me. That made me feel even the more agitated. When he finally finished speaking, he said, "Come with me." I got into a car with him, and was driven out to another location. When we reached the spot, I could see the place abuzz with activity. It was a secluded part of town, but the area had been cordoned off by the police. The press were waiting at a distance. I already began imagining the worst. It looked like a crime scene. The officer escorted me out of the car and walked me to the scene. Martha was following right behind me. As I walked closer, my heart sank, and then reality hit me hard. I could see the mortal remains of my wife. She had been stabbed and bled to death on the floor. I dropped to my knees and was overcome with grief. Tears started flowing down my face. And then I saw Martha kneel down in front of her own body. Realization had finally dawned on her. She looked at me horror-struck. Suddenly, all the events of the past few hours began to make sense to her. The police came to me and said, "Jimmy, stand up. Turn around with your hands behind your back." I did as I was told, and one constable came forward to handcuff me. Martha rose to her feet and started waving her hands in front of the officer, pleading my innocence. But no one could hear her or see her. She burst out into tears as they escorted me into the police van, now as their prime suspect. She just stood outside the window helpless as the car finally drove away to the station. Have you ever been betrayed by the person you trusted the most? I have, and even though that betrayal almost cost me my life, I admit that today I would fall into their trap again. No matter how well you know someone, they always hide a dark secret. Today, I will tell you how I discovered that person's secret and how it was almost the last thing I discovered alive. It all started on Facebook. You know, the social network that even though it's not used much nowadays, at the time, it was more popular than ever. I was a very popular guy. My father told me that it was a natural charm that he also had. And I don't know to what extent I could deny it, since all the men wanted to be my friends and the girls wanted to date me. Anyway, I felt that none of them were really my friends. None of them except Andrew. He was very different from me. He barely had 80 friends on Facebook, while I even had fan pages made by girls of the school. In person, he was only known for hanging out with me. Many people told me he was jealous, to stay away from him. But they didn't understand our friendship. He was the one who always supported me, no matter how popular I was. He was a true friend. Everything was going well with him until one day, I started receiving threatening messages on Facebook. These messages arrived every Friday at 9 p.m. and said that something terrible was going to happen to me. This person would send me messages saying that he would do terrible things to me, and what really scared me the most was that he seemed to know everything about me. My home, my likes and dislikes, my schedule, everything. I tried to block him, but it was pointless because by the next Friday, this person would always create a new account. When I told my father, he told me that it was Andrew for sure. Who else knew so much about me? I found it hard to believe, but even though I hated to admit it, he was right. At that moment, I didn't know how to face him, how to ask him if it was him, until my father had a great idea. Why don't I invite him to my house on Friday for a sleepover at 9 p.m.? I'll check if he's on his cell phone. This stalker had not skipped a single Friday. That same day, I invited him, and to my surprise, he accepted. Little did I know that this was the worst mistake I could make, and that by inviting him to my house, I had fallen right into the trap of a psychopath. The day went by normally. We played some video games and talked about our schoolmates. He seemed normal. He didn't seem scared or expecting to do anything bad to me. When 9 p.m. came, everything changed. I started to see him very nervous, impatient. I was constantly checking my cell phone, but I didn't have the typical stalker's message on my Facebook. Was my dad right? From one second to the next, Andrew nervously asked me to go to the bathroom. And to no one's surprise, that's when the stalker's messages started to arrive. I waited for Andrew to come back so I could confront him, but he didn't. Before my friend arrived, the stalker's messages started coming in. Before my friend arrived, the lights in the house went out. This could not be a coincidence. Up to this point, I thought all Andrew was going to do was threaten me. But at this point, I realized there may be more to it. Maybe the threats were real. Maybe he really wanted to kill me. I tried to run to my father's room, who had probably fallen asleep, but suddenly, someone ran into me. It was pitch dark, and I couldn't see anything, but I felt this person's cold hands violently squeezing my neck. I never imagined that Andrew could be so strong. I couldn't get free. I managed to give him a good punch in the ear, and when I stood up to continue fighting, I couldn't see his face. I saw a terrifying neutral white mask in his place. And in his hand, something was glowing. It was a huge hunter's knife. This was more than I could face, so I ran to my room screaming, asking for my father's help. I managed to lock myself in just a second before it reached me, and after a few kicks on the door, Andrew simply left. I blocked the door with a piece of furniture and escaped through the window. I ran to my neighbor's house and told them everything, and a few minutes later, the police arrived. When we entered the house, Andrew was gone. Only my father was there, who told us that he had a confrontation with my friend, who managed to escape. The sleepover wasn't over yet. Andrew was still out there, hanging around my house. Once we got back from giving our statement at the police station, we went back to the house and it was still empty. I went to the bathroom while my dad was making sure everything was okay, and there I saw it. It was Andrew's cell phone. It had fallen on the floor. I checked his Facebook to make sure that all the messages had been written by him, and I almost screamed in surprise. After checking his inbox, he wasn't the one sending the messages. He was getting them too. That's why he got so nervous at 9 p.m. Because someone told him that they were going to kill him that same day. So if Andrew wasn't the stalker, who was?
Son, is everything all right?
It can't be. The only person who knew me that well besides Andrew was my father. It was all starting to make sense now. My father suggested that Andrew come over. He was the one who supposedly chased the stalker away.
Son, I'm looking at you through the hole in the door.
Whose cell phone is that? Suddenly, the knocking on the door got louder and louder.
Open the door now! I'm not playing!
Terrified, I fell to the floor and called the police. I told them that the stalker was back, and that it was my father. The police, who had stayed nearby just in case, arrived quickly, and at that moment, my father ran away. But they caught him a few blocks away. When the police came to the house to investigate, they went into the basement and found him there. Andrew was in a chair, beaten, gagged, and bound. He was rushed to the hospital, and fortunately, all his injuries were superficial. Once arrested, they discovered that my father was involved in multiple kidnappings and missing persons. Soon after, bodies began to turn up, and my father was convicted. Over time, I learned that my father never intended to kill me. He did all this just to have a chance to kidnap and blame Andrew. Today, we are still best friends, and when people tell me to stay away from him, I just ignore them. Few people know what we went through together on that day. But I will tell you one thing. That was the last day both of us entered Facebook for a while. Back in the day, before technology and social media became such an important part of our daily lives, making friends wasn't as easy as it is now. Most of the pretty women I saw in a day, I would never see again, mostly because I didn't have the balls to walk up to them and get to know them. At the same time, I was what you called a socially awkward person, and I had to go through some other means to get to know people. But then suddenly came Facebook, an app where people can make friends and find out almost everything they wanted to know about someone else, all with a simple friend request. But it wasn't what I thought it'd be, as my experience with Facebook completely changed my life. My name is Timothy Hansen, and the year was 2007. Facebook had just launched 3 years prior and was blowing up in 2006 as people had started preferring it to MySpace. I had been quite skeptical about joining at first, as I wasn't a huge fan of sharing my information online, but I eventually caved and decided to create a Facebook account. If I remember correctly, my first few suggestions were all people in New York, and I spent a while just going through their profiles, wondering if I should send a friend request, and that's when I saw her, Annabelle Tate. She was simply the most beautiful woman I had seen, but what intrigued me the most about her was her profile. It was full of pictures of her and her friends at parties, going on vacations, and in general, just living her best life. I spent a while thinking about what to do before eventually sending her a friend request. She accepted in about 2 hours and texted, "Hi, I'm Annabelle." The conversation from that point flowed, as Annabelle was a very easygoing person, although now that I think about it, I believe it was just the comfort of being behind a screen. We talked for about a week online, majorly about me, as she asked a lot of questions about my past and life in general. I eventually decided to ask her to meet in person. "Do you want to meet up sometime?" She replied, "Sure. Where do you want to meet?" "We could get dinner tomorrow night." "I'm not in the city right now, but I get back tomorrow, so maybe the day after?" "Sure." I went out the next day to the restaurant we had agreed to meet. She wasn't there yet, so I decided to text her and ask her if everything was okay. Is everything all right? I'm on my way, just running a bit late. I waited for about 10 more minutes and then I saw her. The first thing I noticed was Annabelle was a lot skinnier than she looked on her profile. She also had bags under her eyes that she had tried to cover up with makeup. She walked up to me and sat at the table before smiling and saying,
Hey.
I smiled back and replied, You look tired. Are you sure you're okay? She laughed as she picked up the menu and called for the waiter. Annabelle was just as relaxed and easygoing as she was online. We talked about a lot that night, but for the most of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with Annabelle, so I said, Listen, are you sure you're all right? If you're not up for this, we could hang out at my place where I could take you home. She took a while to stare at her food before looking up and replying,
I like the idea of going back to yours.
So we got the check and left. We kept talking as we walked to my apartment. We walked in and I told Annabelle to make herself comfortable while I made her a drink. I made her a gin and tonic and got back from the kitchen to see Annabelle standing playing with her thumbs as if she was nervous, so I said, I know you said everything's all right, but are you sure you're fine? She shook her head and replied,
Look, Tim, you're a really nice guy, but if we're going to go any further in whatever this is, there's something you need to know.
I walked closer to her as my mind raced as to what she was about to say.
You've probably already noticed I look different from my profile. Well, that's because I've not been active for a while on that account. And the reason I've not been active on that account is that I've been really sick, and life's been so shit lately. I don't know how much longer I have or if I even have time at all.
She was crying now, but all I could think about was how her profile managed to paint a completely fake picture of who she was. She continued with,
My family's been telling me it isn't the end and I should still try to be me, and that's why I accepted your friend request. I just don't want you to get your hopes up.
She kept crying, so I reached out and gave her a hug. She was so close to me. She felt so good, and she smelled so good. So good. It's fine, Annabelle, I said before placing my hand on her cheek. Some stupid disease won't take someone as beautiful as you from the world. No, that wouldn't be fair. Her facial expression changed as she tried to slip away from the hug, but I tightened my grip, continuing with, I really didn't ever think it'd be this easy to get a woman as beautiful as you alone in my home. It's usually so hard having to follow them around, or just taking one I don't know anything about with them crying and screaming the whole time. I won't ever forget the feeling I got seeing the look of realization on Annabelle's face as I spoke. The worry and fear were nothing like I had seen before. She tried hitting me, but there was no use as I dragged her and held her down on the couch, and that's when she began screaming. I grabbed her throat and pressed down so hard, saying, Stop screaming, Annabelle. Don't worry, you won't have to bother about how much longer you have to live. Her struggle continued, but not for long. I had my way with her as she passed out and died. So there you have it, officer. Annabelle Tate was my first time using Facebook, and my, what an experience she was. You're a sick man, Timothy. I'll make sure you spend the rest of your days behind bars. Say what you will, officer, but if you ask me, I didn't do anything wrong. All I did was ask to be their friend, and they agreed. All I truly wanted were some friends. You raped and killed 19 women using Facebook, and God knows how many before that. And you say all you wanted were friends? Well, you won't have to worry about that anymore. You'll soon find out what happens to your kind in prison. I'm sure a lot of people would like to be your friend. I hope so. People like you don't deserve compassion. Well, if that's true, officer, I guess it's a good thing I found Facebook.